Okay, I think that's on. So thanks, Maria. So yes, this is me, Elaine McGreevy, just giving you hopefully only 15 minutes of some brief thoughts around the gendering of autism and possibly just some kind of thoughts to expand just beyond stereotyping. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but obviously the most recent prevalence is a 3-to-1 ratio of males to females in the UK, and that's the same in Northern Ireland. Indeed, 1 in 24 school children in Northern Ireland are autistic, and 3-to-1 ratio. So all of my years of working as a speech and language therapist in this area, I suppose I meet the parents of autistic children. I read and listen and talk to autistic people all the time, and these are the things that echo for me, that so many people have been not identified as autistic, and they have been mislabeled. I mean, the amount of young children that I have come across who might have been mislabeled as obstinate, oppositional defiant disorder, borderline personality disorder is another one that young women seem to get. And they're a great website to link into is 𝗘𝗹𝗶𝗃𝗆, and there's a great blog on there about someone who got a range of diagnoses: ADHD, anxiety, depression, borderline personality disorder, gender identity disorder, OCD, a lot of disorders there actually, but actually all those labels would fall away when this person was given an autistic identity. And that's what really matters. As Una said, at 70 years old, it doesn't matter, but it really does matter, because who you are. So I do worry sometimes that in society we have this confirmation bias, which says that we all as society know what autistic people look like. We have an idea of what autistic women look like. We have an idea of what autistic boys look like. But in some ways, then that's just what we're looking for. And then when we see that stereotype, that confirms our bias, and we go, yes, you're autistic and you're not. And then I think that's where we have some challenges around it. It takes a long time for somebody to arrive at that identity and that authentic diagnosis that makes sense to who they are. And of course, I am conscious of the transgender and the gender diverse community who may be non-binary, who are trans male, trans female, and where do they fit when we use these particular male and female kind of stereotypes. So I think the challenge to us always is to look broad and stay open-minded. And it's not our fault, because we've been educated by the researchers who were very biased, as was referenced in the previous research about the gender bias in research. And obviously Simon Baron-Cohen, his extreme male brain theory, theorizing that autistic people were autistic because they had more male hormones, and so that they were less likely to have empathy, more likely to have a systemizing brain. So that has stayed in our echoes of how we think about autistic people, and in some way it creates that bias when we're looking at the people that we meet in diagnostic clinics or in our lives. And then, of course, but because people were recognizing that this was a difficulty, then, there has been a great effort to try to redress that balance. So obviously, the research that has been done on female autism, suggesting there is a protective element. So that's why autistic women are not identified or aren't autistic. That's not been proven. The female autism phenotype. So really this description of the classic female presentation, that is that person who's very likely to be a masking person, very able to socially manage a lot of situations while internally laboring really hard over that whole interaction and the excessive thinking about, am I doing the right thing here and there? So I suppose we do recognize that profile, but of course My thing is, what about the non-binary? What about the trans people that, when they don't fit those particular labels, those stereotypes, where do they fit? And does that have a stigmatizing effect for them? Does that have an exclusion? Are we excluding them then in the conversation and the narrative about what it is to be autistic, what is autistic lived experience? So great research. I really recommend you to search it out. Amy Pearson and Kieran Rose, the conceptual analysis of masking. So it's a super paper. It's just been released, and I've got a few quotes in there. And Kieran Rose probably for me is one of the leading voices in understanding masking. So, and I suppose what he says is that partly this idea of what you think an autistic boy is, and then an autistic girl, that so the autistic girl is doing more of the stereotyped things that we expect of women in our society. So that's really, again, our confirmation bias that is saying, well, if she lines up her teddies on her bed, sure, that's very cute, that's very nice and cuddly, that's not anything. Whereas the little guy, if he knows all the dinosaurs and he can line them all up, that's totally autistic. So I think, our challenge is to kind of throw some of that stereotyping out. This is a really good quote from an anonymous contributor in the Neurodiversity Reader, which was a great book published last year with Damien Milton as one of the lead editors. But obviously this lady was a woman who basically said, if we're not obviously on the spectrum, just like Temple Grandin, we're not pegged as having the disorder at all. And opposite to our opposite gender peers, our autistic diagnosis is a personality flaw that we're responsible for. So we get blamed and we get gaslit for, being too sensitive or being too rude. We're using the wrong tone. And so any understanding of sarcasm, nuance, or humor in general becomes evidence that we're faking it. She can't be autistic because she has a sense of humor. She can't be autistic because she makes eye contact. She can't be autistic because she's got great empathy. And actually, that's really the confirmation bias that we need to throw out. We need to understand that the truth about autistic people is they are just as diverse as anyone else. And yes, of course, they can make eye contact in trusting relationships, or if they've actually learned to mask that skill. And yes, of course, autistic people have empathy, absolutely buckets, to the point that it can hurt. So factors affecting identification. So yes, the gender bias. So basically, I think this is a great statement within that piece of research I was just reading. Judging how autistic a person appears to be is how well they're to perform on non-autistic behaviors. So I sort of, as a diagnostician, I have increasingly got a great dissatisfaction with working in the medical model, where you have to describe someone with deficits in order to identify them as autistic. You have to measure them against a neuronormative standards to say they're autistic. So I feel the process in itself, while it can be very positive and validating, and certainly if it's me working with any family, I do it in a positive, strength-based way. But ultimately, I'm comparing this person to a set of criteria that says they have deficits. And I think we have a long way to go before, well, I think we should change it, but I'm not in charge of changing all of these criteria. But I think we should think hard about it, because Louise referenced stigma earlier in her talk. And Jodie talked about this pressure that she had to mask from an early age. That she didn't know that was a pressure. She felt that was a pressure inside, but that is a society pressure. That's stigma that's on the outside. And part of it is working in a medical model. And part of it is the medical model language that we use. And I think that there needs to be something around that. I think I'm going off at a tangent here because I sometimes I think, well, what we're in a diagnostic process, we are looking for such strong characteristics to say, yes, they clearly have these deficits. But what about the internalizing presentation of being autistic? What if you're sitting really still? What if you've learned to nod your head and agree and ask a few socially interested questions, and you can manage social interactions to a certain extent? It doesn't mean you're not autistic. It just means that assessment and the medical model framing and the gender bias criteria is not allowing us to really identify you. And that for me is a real problem that I have day to day. And then I suppose sometimes when we ask the parents, tell us about your son or daughter, or do they have things that they're passionate about and how passionate are they? Sometimes the parents may not know the extent of the child's interests or stims, for example, and they may not be able to give that. So it's not that you're not autistic, it just means that the information cannot be gathered at this time, has not been uncovered. And that's one of the reasons why it can take a longer time. And masking, just wanted a few little points on that. A lot of people have talked about it. It is a key thing, but this is a really important, I think, leap forward in the understanding of masking from this recent research. So autistic masking is the conscious but also unconscious suppression. So our speakers talked about consciously acting and performing, but there is also an unconscious suppression of your natural responses and adoptions of alternatives like the neuronormative behaviors across interactions, and that can happen early in life. And certainly Kieran Rose, the Autistic Advocate on Facebook, that's where his page is. He has a website as well, but he will say, and in this research, it's called an anxiety, a trauma response, and it's rooted in early socialization and sensory differences. And the reason is for self-protection, so that you don't be punished, victimized, bullied, joked at, sneered at. You will then adopt these camouflaging behaviors. And the fawning, that Jodie mentioned that earlier, that unbelievable urge to please other people, which is another masking response, and can leave you in a vulnerable situation if you don't know yourself and you don't know that vulnerability. And of course, we know that the masking is related to poor outcomes for autistic people. So all the very recent research about the mental health issues and the suicidality links with masking is correlated. Autistic burnout, finally, because autistic people have been talking about autistic burnout for the longest time, but now we have a piece of research that actually describes that and all the factors that feed into that. And as an autistic person, it's important to know that could happen and know what it is, because then that's one of the things can be mislabeled when you're having a mental health assessment as well. I see I've probably a 2-minute warning coming up, so we're nearly finished anyway. So I just want to urge us all, as clinicians, as just interested people, to really go beyond stereotypes. There is a great diversity in humanity. No two human beings are the same. And so everyone comes with their own variety of learning ability, attentional control, lived experience from life experiences that might have been traumatic, neurology, epilepsy, dyspraxia, other conditions. So that's your neurology, your psychology. So that you're never going to get another person like you. So autistic women have different experiences to autistic men, for sure. Just like Black people have different experiences to white autistic people, just like trans women have different experiences to cis women. So how autism presents is influenced by all the same factors for all humans, by your color, your race, your religion, your culture, your family experiences, and your life events. So really, for me, it's about when we meet a person who is thinking they might be autistic, or their family thinks they might be autistic, it's to, yes, be aware of female presentations, male presentations, but actually just listen to the autistic person tell their story, create that place for them to open up. So, most times I just let autistic people tell me their story, and I can hear and see their characteristics, their different style. So my last page, be curious and open-minded to support autistic people. There is no right way to be a human being. Learn from autistic people, advocates and researchers, and great examples of wonderful advocates here tonight who have educated us all. Just be aware of how autism stereotyping actually denies a person's need to be identified. You're too mild. You make eye contact, you've got friends. You don't need to have this diagnosis. Why do you need it? You need it because Una said it mattered. You know, keep up to date with contemporary research. So double empathy problem really recognizes that autistic people don't have empathy difficulties. In fact, there's a shared empathy difficulty between autistic and non-autistic people. Diversity and social intelligence, recognizing that autistic social interaction is a valid social interaction. It's not deficient, not disordered. It's a valid way of interacting and communicating. Monotropism, autistic people tend to process in a tunnel processing. So actually, if we could work to that strength, you know, 𝗘𝗹𝗶𝗶 who's at the University of Sheffield, he really advocates for in secondary schools, instead of pupils having 30-minute lessons, if somebody is autistic and they have a monotropic tunnel processing, they should be doing 3 hours of history instead of starting and stopping every 30 minutes. Reject social skills training for autistic children and adults, because that is really damaging. Because if we know that masking is damaging, social skills training is actively reinforcing masking, and that's damaging. And there's nothing wrong with autistic social interaction, it's perfectly valid. And focus on a strengths-based model. Support the person to learn to be a self-advocate, know your own boundaries, express your own boundaries, express your needs, and autonomy versus independence. So I know as a speech therapist working with children, that can be a big focus on he needs to be independent, he needs to be this. But I actually know from listening to autistic adults, sometimes they do need help from certain people at certain times to live the life they want to live, not compared to anybody else, but live a good autistic life. And that's being autonomous rather than independent, and support for sensory needs. So that's me done. Thank you for listening.